A hardened Texas rancher offered one night's shelter to a Comanche widow and her starving baby, never knowing this single act of mercy would shatter his hatred, ignite a deadly pursuit across the frontier, and prove that love could bloom even in the most barren of hearts, West Texas Territory, February 1869. The wind howled across the Llano Estacado like the screams of dying men, carrying with it the promise of a blue norther that would freeze anything foolish enough to be caught in the open. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the endless prairie in a shroud of white that stretched to every horizon. The storm was the kind that killed cattle, buried fence lines, and reminded every soul on the frontier that nature held the ultimate authority over life and death.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Benjamin Steele's ranch house sat like a fortress against the elements, its thick stone walls and heavy timber roof built to withstand whatever the Texas plains could unleash. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady column, the only sign of life for miles in any direction. Inside, the fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings of a man who had learned to live with only what he needed to survive. Ben crouched before the flames, feeding in split mesquite logs. With the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual he had repeated countless times. At 38, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much hardship and too little joy. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his green eyes held the cold distance of someone who had built walls so high that even he had forgotten what lay behind them. The ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving land in Texas, populated by longhorn cattle tough enough to survive on sparse grass and bitter water. Ben had carved this empire from nothing, fighting Comanche raiders, rustlers, drought, and isolation to build something that was entirely his own. But the cost had been everything else that might have made life worth living. He had not spoken to another human being in 6 weeks. The last cowhand had quit when the snows started, unwilling to face a winter alone with a boss who communicated mostly in grunts and paid in silver coins. Counted out with grudging precision, Ben preferred it that way. People were complications, and complications led to disappointment, betrayal, and pain. Better to face the wilderness alone than to trust in the fickleness of human nature. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows in ghostly curtains. Ben rolled his shoulders beneath his thick wool shirt, feeling the permanent ache that came from years of hard labor and harder living. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers that would never be answered. Then came the sound that changed everything. It was not the howl of wind or the creak of timber settling under snow. It was something else, something that made Ben freeze with one hand on the iron poker. A rhythmic thudding, desperate and weak, against the heavy oak door. 3 quick raps, then silence. Then 3 more, even fainter, as if whatever was making the sound was running out of strength. Ben's hand moved instinctively to the Colt peacemaker hanging from his gun belt. In his years on this ranch, visitors had brought nothing but trouble. Drifters looking to steal what they could carry. Rustlers scouting his herds. Comanche war parties seeking revenge for battles fought and lost. Every stranger was a potential threat, and Ben had survived by treating them all as such. The knocking came again, weaker this time, followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, barely audible through the thick door but unmistakably human. Ben cursed under his breath and moved toward the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Then the porch lantern's glow caught movement, and Ben's breath stopped in his throat. A figure huddled against his door, wrapped in what looked like buffalo hide and elk skin. The person was small, slight, and clutching something against their chest. As he watched, The figure raised a trembling hand and knocked again, the sound barely audible against the storm's fury. Ben's mind raced through possibilities. No one traveled in weather like this unless they were running from something worse than freezing to death. No one brought a baby into a blizzard unless they had no other choice. And no one knocked on Benjamin Steele's door unless they were desperate. Enough to risk being shot for the privilege. He cocked the pistol with a soft metallic click and approached the door. His hand rested on the heavy wooden bar that secured it, and for a moment he hesitated. 6 weeks of isolation had been peaceful. 6 weeks without complications, without human drama, without anyone depending on him for anything beyond keeping the cattle alive and the property secure. Opening that door would end all of that. The baby cried again, a sound so weak and pitiful that it cut through Ben's defenses like a knife through paper. He had heard that sound before, years ago, in circumstances that still haunted his dreams. Before he could reconsider, he lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The figure collapsed forward into his arms. And Ben found himself holding a young Comanche woman, wrapped in traditional winter clothing, that spoke of a people who knew how to survive on the plains. Her long black hair was matted with snow and ice, and her copper skin was pale with cold and exhaustion. In her arms, she clutched a baby wrapped in soft deerskin, both of them trembling with a violence that spoke of hours in the killing cold. "Please," she whispered through blue lips, her English heavily accented but clear. "My baby, he is dying from the cold." Ben stared down at her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A Comanche woman, alone in a blizzard, carrying a baby and begging for help from a white rancher who had every reason to consider her people his enemies. Everything about the situation screamed danger. Comanche were known for using women and children as distractions, while war parties positioned themselves for attack. This could be a trap, a trick, a prelude to having his throat cut in his own home. But as he looked into her dark eyes, Ben saw something that cut through his suspicion. Not cunning or deception, but the raw terror of a mother watching her child die. He had seen that look before, in another woman's eyes, in another lifetime that he had spent 5 years trying to forget. "Get inside," he said gruffly, stepping back to allow her entry. She stumbled across the threshold, her legs barely able to support her weight. Ben closed the door against the storm and threw the bar back in place, then turned to study his unexpected guests. The woman was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with the kind of natural beauty that transcended cultural differences. But it was her obvious devotion to the baby that held his attention. Even in her exhausted state, she held the child with infinite care, whispering to him in what Ben assumed was Comanche. "How long have you been out there?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. 2 days, she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Maybe 3. The storm, it came so fast." Ben gestured toward the fire. "Get over there. Get warm." She moved slowly toward the hearth, her movements stiff with cold and caution. Ben noticed that she kept herself positioned so she could see both him and the door, ready to run if necessary. Smart woman. She had no more reason to trust him than he had to trust her. As she settled near the fire, Ben got his first clear look at the baby. The child was perhaps 6 months old, with the perfect features of mixed heritage that spoke of both Comanche and white ancestry. His tiny face was flushed with fever, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Whatever had brought this woman to his door, the baby's condition was genuinely desperate. Ben moved to his supply cabinet and retrieved a heavy wool blanket, the softest one he owned. Without a word, he knelt beside the woman and wrapped it around both her and the child. She flinched at his proximity, but did not pull away. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Senna," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is my son, Ayaka's." Ben nodded and stood, moving to the stove where he kept a pot of coffee perpetually brewing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
He poured the bitter liquid into a tin cup and brought it to her, noting how her hands shook as she accepted it. "Drink," he commanded. "You need the warmth." Senna sipped the coffee gratefully, wincing at its strength but allowing the heat to begin thawing her frozen body. Ben watched her carefully, noting the way she held herself with dignity despite her desperate circumstances. This was not a woman accustomed to begging for help. "Where did you come from?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her but keeping his hand near his pistol. Senna's eyes flicked to his weapon, then back to the fire. "My husband's people, they have winter camp 2 days north. But the white soldiers, they came 3 days ago. Killed many, scattered the rest." Ben felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. The army had been conducting winter campaigns against Comanche bands throughout the territory, driving them from their traditional camping grounds and forcing them onto reservations. It was brutal but effective warfare designed to break the spirit of a people who had ruled these plains for generations. "Your husband?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Dead," Senna replied simply. "Killed fighting the soldiers so others could escape. He told me to take Iacos and run south, find safety with Mexican traders. But the storm, it caught us. I lost my horse yesterday, all my supplies." Ben studied her face, looking for signs of deception. But Senna's grief was real, carved into her features like words etched in stone. She was telling the truth, at least about the immediate circumstances that had brought her to his door. "Why come here?" he asked. "Why risk approaching a white man's ranch?" Senna looked down at her son, whose breathing seemed to be growing more labored. "Because my baby was dying, and you were the only light I could see in all this darkness. I thought, maybe, if you had children of your own." "I don't," Ben said quickly, more harshly than he intended. Something in his tone made Senna look up, and for a moment their eyes met across the firelit space. In that instant, Ben saw a flash of understanding pass between them. They were both alone, both carrying burdens that had shaped them into solitary creatures. Both survivors of losses that had left scars deeper than flesh. The baby stirred in Senna's arms, making a small sound of distress. She immediately shifted her attention to him, loosening the deerskin wrapping to check his condition. Ben could see that the child's lips were still blue despite the warmth of the fire, and his tiny hands were clenched in fists that spoke of pain. "He needs medicine," Senna said desperately. "Willow bark tea, or white man's medicine. Something to break the fever." Ben considered his options. He had some basic medical supplies, left over from years of treating injured cattle and the occasional cowhand mishap. But using them would mean committing to helping these strangers, acknowledging that their welfare had become his responsibility. "I have some things," he said finally. "Might help." He moved to a wooden crate in the corner that served as his medicine chest. Inside were bottles of various powders and tinctures, remnants of a time when he had been forced to serve as doctor, veterinarian, and surgeon to everything. On his ranch, he selected a small bottle of willow bark extract and a packet of fever powder. "This should help with the fever," he said, handing the medicines to Senna. "Mix a small amount in warm water. But carefully, it's strong." Senna accepted the bottles with something approaching reverence. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know you have no reason to help us." Ben turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. We'll see if it works." As Senna prepared the medicine, Ben found himself studying her more closely. Despite her exhaustion and desperate circumstances, she moved with the grace of someone trained in traditional ways. Her clothing, though travel-worn, showed the skilled beadwork and careful construction that marked her as a woman of status within her tribe. This was not some random refugee, but someone important, someone whose loss would be felt. "Your husband," Ben said suddenly. What was his position among your people? Senna paused in her preparations. He was a war chief. Young, but respected. The soldiers, they knew his name, offered bounty for his capture. Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If Senna was the widow of a known war chief, her presence here could bring more trouble than he had imagined. The army would be looking for her, and any white settler found harboring the family of an enemy leader could face charges of treason. "Did anyone see you come here?" he asked urgently. "I do not think so. The storm, it covers all tracks, hides all movement." "But," she hesitated, then continued, "there were men following me, not soldiers, but hunters. Men who seek bounties on Comanche scalps." Ben's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Scalp hunters were a breed apart from regular army troops, men who operated outside military authority and answered to no law but profit. They were brutal, efficient, and utterly without mercy when it came to their prey. "How far behind you?" he demanded. "I do not know. The storm may have stopped them, or it may have only slowed them down. They are persistent, these men. They know the value of a war chief's family." Ben stood and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The storm showed no signs of abating, but experienced trackers could follow a trail even in difficult conditions. If scalp hunters were tracking Senna, they would not be deterred by weather. "Listen to me," he said, turning back to face her. "If these men come here, they'll kill all of us without hesitation. You, the baby me, anyone they think might have helped you. Do you understand what you've brought to my door?" Senna's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or desperation. "I brought a dying baby who needed warmth and medicine, nothing more. If you want us to leave, in this storm, with a sick child?" Ben shook his head. "That would be murder, pure and simple." They stared at each other across the firelit room, and Ben realized he had reached a point of no return. Whatever came next, whatever consequences arose from this night, he had already made his choice. These two refugees were now under his protection. Whether he had planned it or not, the baby's breathing began to ease as the medicine took effect, and Senna's shoulders sagged with relief. She looked up at Ben with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, more complex. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help us when it puts you in danger?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as memories he had spent years suppressing rose unbidden to the surface. A different woman, a different child, a different time when his choices had led to tragedy instead of redemption. "Because," he said finally, "some debts can only be paid forward." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the Texas plains, but inside the ranch house, something had shifted. Two wounded souls had found temporary shelter from their respective storms, and neither would emerge unchanged. Ben Steele had opened his door to strangers, and in doing so, had opened his heart to possibilities he had thought buried forever. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, both Ben and Senna settled into an uneasy vigil over the sleeping baby. Neither spoke of the dangers that might be approaching with the dawn, but both understood that their lives had become intertwined in ways that would test everything they thought they knew about survival, loyalty, and the redemptive power of unexpected mercy. The first pale light of dawn crept through the shutters like a cautious animal, bringing with it the silence that follows great storms. Ben had not slept, spending the night alternating between watching the door and studying the woman who had transformed his solitary world in the space of a few hours. Senna dozed fitfully beside the dying fire, her son finally breathing easily. In her arms, the fever broken by Ben's medicines and her tireless devotion, Ben moved quietly to the window and peered through the gap in the shutters. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world sculpted entirely in white. Snow drifted against the porch railings and fence posts, creating an alien landscape that would challenge even experienced trackers. But Ben knew that determined men could Follow a trail even through such conditions, and scalp hunters were nothing if not determined. He turned back to find Senna awake, watching him with dark eyes that missed nothing. She had not moved from her position near the hearth, but her body was tense with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. The baby slept peacefully against her chest, his tiny face finally showing healthy color. "The storm has ended," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken implications. Ben nodded, moving to stoke the fire back to life. "Your boy looks better, thanks to you," Senna replied, adjusting the blanket around her son. "The fever broke near midnight." "He will live, good," Ben said, though his tone remained carefully neutral. In daylight, with the immediate crisis past, he found himself questioning the wisdom of his actions. Harboring a Comanche widow was dangerous enough, but the child's mixed heritage suggested complications he had not yet considered. Senna seemed to sense his thoughts. "You are wondering about my son's father," she said with quiet dignity. Ben paused in his fire tending. "Not my business, perhaps not, but you deserve to know what you have risked your life to protect," Senna continued, her voice steady despite the personal nature of her revelation. "Iacos is not my husband's son by blood. His father was a white trader named James Morrison, a man who lived among my people for 2 years. Ben felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest. Mixed-race children were caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, often rejected by both. In Comanche society, such children could be accepted if adopted by a warrior husband, but among whites they faced discrimination, and worse. Morrison was killed by the same soldiers who destroyed our camp," Senna continued, her voice hardening with remembered pain. "They found him teaching Comanche children to read English, called him a traitor to his own race. My husband died defending Morrison's right to live among us, his family." Ben absorbed this information in silence, understanding now why Senna had been willing to risk approaching his ranch. A half-white child would have a better chance of survival among whites than pure Comanche, but only if he could find someone willing to overlook his heritage. "The bounty hunters," Ben said slowly. "They know about the boy's parentage?" Senna's expression darkened. "They know. It makes him more valuable to them, not less. A war chief's adopted son, a white trader's blood child. They can collect bounties from both sides." Before Ben could respond, a sound from outside made both of them freeze. Not the natural settling of snow or the movement of wind, but something deliberate and purposeful. Footsteps, muffled but distinct, circling the house with the patience of predators. Ben moved swiftly to his gun cabinet and withdrew a Winchester rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. "How many men were following you?" he whispered. "3. Maybe 4, Senna replied, instantly alert. She gathered the baby closer, her eyes scanning the room for potential escape routes. "They are led by a man named Garrett Pike, a former Army scout who turned to bounty hunting when the military would not pay him enough." Ben knew the name. Pike had a reputation throughout the territory as a skilled tracker and merciless killer. A man who viewed Indians as vermin to be exterminated for profit. If Pike was leading the hunt for Senna, they were dealing with a professional who would not be easily deterred. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. Ben positioned himself behind the heavy oak table, rifle trained on the entrance, while Senna moved to the far corner of the room where she would be protected by the stone fireplace. The baby remained quiet, as if sensing the danger. A voice called out from the porch, rough and confident. "Benjamin Steele, we know you're in there, and we know you're harboring a Comanche squaw and her half-breed brat. Send them out, and we'll let you live." Ben said nothing, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Negotiating with men like Pike was pointless. They would kill everyone in the house regardless of cooperation. "I'm talking to you, Steele." Pike's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to intimidating others. "We tracked the woman's trail right to your door. Storm couldn't hide everything. Now you can make this easy on yourself, or you can make it hard. Either way, we're taking our bounty." Ben glanced at Senna, who had pulled a long knife from beneath her winter clothing. Her expression was calm but determined, the look of a woman prepared to die fighting rather than surrender. The baby stirred in her arms but did not cry. "You got 10 seconds to open this door," Pike continued, "or we'll burn you out." "Your choice." Ben made his decision. "Pike," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the heavy door. "You know who I am. You know what I've done. You really want to try taking something from my land?" There was a pause, then Pike's laughter, harsh and humorless. "Ben Steele, the hero of Adobe Walls. Yeah, I heard the stories. How you held off 50 Comanche warriors with nothing but a rifle and bad attitude. But that was a long time ago, old man. And you're outnumbered." Ben's jaw tightened at the reference to his past. Adobe Walls was a name he had hoped never to hear again, a battle that had made his reputation and destroyed his soul. But if Pike wanted to play on that history, Ben would oblige him. "I'm not the same man I was at Adobe Walls," Ben called back. "I'm older, meaner, and I've got a lot less to lose. You want to test that? Come ahead." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Ben could hear Pike conferring with his men in low voices, calculating odds and options. These were not soldiers bound by military discipline, but mercenaries motivated solely by profit. If the cost became too high, they might withdraw and seek easier prey. "Tell you what, Steele," Pike said finally. "You hand over the squaw and the brat, and we'll let you keep whatever supplies and weapons they had. Fair trade." "Counteroffer," Ben replied, his voice deadly calm. "You ride away now, and I don't kill all of you where you stand." Pike's response was immediate and violent. The front window exploded inward as a rifle shot shattered the glass, sending shards flying across the room. Ben dropped behind the table as more shots followed, the thick oak absorbing the bullets with solid thuds. Senna had flattened herself against the stone fireplace, shielding the baby with her body while keeping the knife ready. Her eyes met Ben's across the chaos, and he saw in them the same cold resolve that had kept her alive through the destruction of her tribe and the death of her husband. "Back door," Ben shouted over the gunfire. "Can you make it?" Senna shook her head. "They will have men waiting. This Pike, he is too experienced to leave escape routes unguarded." Ben cursed under his breath and fired a shot through the broken window, rewarded by a yelp of pain from outside. But he could hear movement on the roof now, the sound of boots on wooden shingles. Pike's men were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. "Steele." Pike's voice came from a different position now, closer to the back of the house. "You're just making this harder on yourself. We got men on the roof, men at every door. No way out." Ben's mind raced through possibilities. The house was solidly built, but it was not a fortress. Pike had enough men to overwhelm any defense, if they were willing to accept casualties. But mercenaries were fundamentally different from soldiers. They fought for money, not honor, and dead men collected no bounties. "Senna," Ben said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, hidden under the loose board by the stove. If I can create enough distraction, you might be able to get down there with the baby. What about you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the danger. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Maybe long enough for you to slip away when they focus on the house." Senna's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "You would die for strangers? For people your own kind considers enemies?" Ben was quiet for a moment, listening to the sounds of men positioning themselves around his home. "Maybe I'm tired of living with the consequences of not dying for the right people." Before Senna could respond, the roof above them exploded in a shower of sparks and burning debris. Pike's men had dropped flaming brands through the chimney, and the fire was spreading rapidly across the wooden ceiling beams. "Smoke them out," Pike shouted triumphantly. "Can't hide in a burning house." Ben grabbed a bucket of water from beside the stove and threw it on the worst of the flames, but he could see it was a losing battle. The fire was spreading faster than he could control it, and the smoke was already becoming thick enough to choke them. "The cellar," he said urgently to Senna. Now, while they're focused on the fire, but Senna was no longer listening to him. Her attention was fixed on something outside, visible through the shattered window. Her face had gone pale, and she was speaking rapidly in Comanche, words that sounded like prayers or curses. "What is it?" Ben demanded, following her gaze. Through the smoke and flames, he could see riders approaching from the east, their horses' dark silhouettes against the snow. At first, Ben thought they were more of Pike's men, but as they drew closer, he realized his mistake. These were not white bounty hunters but Comanche warriors, their war paint visible even at distance. "My husband's brothers," Senna whispered, her voice mixing hope and fear. "They have come for us," the sound of approaching hoofbeats caused immediate confusion among Pike's men. Ben could hear shouted orders and the scrambling of boots as the bounty hunters tried to reposition themselves to face this new threat. But they were caught between the burning house and an unknown number of mounted warriors. "How many?" Ben asked, squinting through the smoke. "I count 8, Senna replied, her eyes tracking the approaching riders. "Enough to even the odds, but not enough to guarantee victory." Ben made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Can you signal them? Let them know you're inside." Senna nodded and moved to the window, careful to avoid the flames now spreading across the ceiling. She called out in Comanche, her voice carrying the particular cadence that warriors used to identify themselves to their own people. The response came immediately, a series of war cries that made Ben's blood run cold, despite his current alliance with their source. The Comanche warriors had identified their target and were preparing to charge. "Get down," Ben said, pulling Senna away from the window as bullets began flying in both directions. Pike's men were now caught between the burning house and the approaching war party, fighting a battle on two fronts with no clear escape route. The next few minutes were chaos incarnate. Gunshots echoed across the snow-covered landscape as Pike's men tried to maintain their position while being charged by mounted warriors whose war cries cut through the air like blades. Ben could hear Pike himself shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but the psychological impact of facing Comanche warriors was taking its toll. "The fire is spreading too fast," Senna said, coughing as smoke filled the room. "We must leave now, or we will burn with the house." Ben looked around his home, seeing 15 years of careful solitude being consumed by flames. Everything he had built, everything he had accumulated, was being destroyed in a battle he had never asked to fight. But as he looked at Senna and her child, he realized that some things were more important than possessions. "The back door," he said decisively. "Pike's men are distracted by the warriors. We might be able to slip out." They moved quickly through the smoke-filled house, Ben leading with his rifle while Senna followed with the baby. The back door was not yet engulfed in flames, but Ben could hear the fire spreading overhead like a living thing consuming everything in its path. He threw open the door and immediately came face to face with one of Pike's men, a young bounty hunter who had been left to guard the rear exit. The man's eyes widened in surprise, and he started to raise his rifle. Ben's shot took him in the chest, dropping him into the snow before he could cry out. "Move," Ben said to Senna, stepping over the body. They emerged into the cold morning air just as the main battle reached its climax. Pike's remaining men had formed a defensive circle near the barn, but they were being overwhelmed by the mobility and ferocity of the Comanche attack. Ben could see Pike himself, recognizable by his distinctive cavalry hat, directing the defense with the skill of an experienced soldier. "This way," Senna said, leading them toward a stand of cottonwood trees that offered concealment. "My husband's brothers will not expect us to flee the battle." But as they reached the trees, Ben heard Pike's voice calling out over the gunfire. "There! the squaw and the half-breed. Don't let them escape. Two of Pike's men broke from the defensive circle and spurred their horses toward the trees. Ben raised his rifle and fired, missing the first rider but spoiling his aim. The second man had a clear shot at Senna, and Ben realized with crystal clarity that he would not be able to reload in time. The Comanche warrior seemed to materialize out of the smoke like an avenging spirit, his war cry echoing across the battlefield as he rode down Pike's man from behind. The bounty hunter's shot went wide, and the warrior's lance found its mark with deadly precision. "Tokala!" Senna called out, recognizing the warrior who had saved them. "My husband's blood brother." The warrior wheeled his horse and rode toward them, his paint-streaked face showing relief at finding Senna alive. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, his words urgent and demanding. "He says we must leave now," Senna translated for Ben. "More white soldiers are coming from the south. This battle will bring them like wolves to blood." Ben looked back at his burning house, watching 15 years of his life being consumed by flames. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was being destroyed. But as he looked at Senna and her child, he realized that some losses were worth the price. "Tell him I'm coming with you," Ben said, surprising himself with the words. Senna stared at him. "You cannot. You are white, and we are going to places where white men are killed on sight. Then I'll take my chances," Ben replied, checking his rifle and gathering what ammunition he could carry. "I opened my door to you, and now I'm seeing it through to the end." The warrior Tokala spoke again, his tone sharp with urgency. In the distance, Ben could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats, too many and too organized to be anything but military. "The soldiers," Senna said, her face pale with new fear. "If they find us here with you, they will assume you are a traitor." Ben shouldered his rifle and looked toward the sound of approaching cavalry. His old life was burning behind him, and his new one was racing toward an uncertain future with people who had every reason to consider him an enemy. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. "Then we better not let them find us," he said, and followed Senna toward the horses the warriors had brought. Behind them, Pike's voice rose in fury over the sound of flames and gunfire, but Ben no longer cared about the bounty hunter's threats. He had made his choice, and whatever came next, he would face it with the courage he had forgotten he possessed. The Comanche war party moved across the frozen landscape like ghosts from another world, their unshod ponies finding purchase on ice-covered rocks that would have sent cavalry horses tumbling to their deaths. Ben rode behind Tokala on a paint stallion that seemed to read the terrain with supernatural awareness, while Senna and her baby were secured on the lead warrior's mount, wrapped in buffalo robes that had been warmed by the fire before their desperate flight. They had been riding for 3 hours through country that Ben had never seen despite 15 years on the frontier. The warriors led them through hidden valleys and ancient game trails that wound between towering mesas, following paths that had been used by their people for generations. Behind them, the smoke from Ben's burning ranch house had long since disappeared. But the memory of Pike's furious shout still echoed in Ben's mind. "How much further?" Ben asked Tokala, using the few words of Comanche he had learned during his years of fighting and trading with various tribes. The warrior pointed toward a gap between two massive red stone formations that rose from the desert floor like the pillars of some ancient temple. "Pahasapa," he said in his own language, then switched to broken English. "Sacred place. White eyes not welcome, but Senna say you earn right to see." Ben understood that he was being granted an extraordinary privilege. The Comanche guarded their sacred sites jealously, and few whites had ever been allowed to witness their most important ceremonies and gathering places. That Senna had convinced the warriors to bring him here spoke to both her influence among her late husband's people and their desperate need for a secure refuge. As they approached the gap between the stone formations, Ben could see that it was actually the entrance to a hidden canyon, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side and narrowing to a passage barely wide enough for 2 horses to ride abreast. The warriors dismounted and began leading their horses through the entrance, their voices dropping to whispers as they entered what was clearly sacred ground. This place has been sanctuary for our people for more winters than memory holds, Senna explained quietly as they followed the warriors into the canyon. No enemy has ever found the entrance, and no white man has ever violated its peace. The canyon walls were covered with ancient pictographs that told the story of the Comanche people, their hunts, their battles, their spiritual beliefs rendered in ochre and charcoal pigments that had survived centuries of wind and weather. Ben found himself staring at images of buffalo herds that stretched to the horizon, of warriors on horseback locked in combat with enemies both human and supernatural, of women and children dancing around fires that seemed to flicker with life. Even in their painted form, my husband's grandfather painted some of these, Senna said, pointing to a series of figures that depicted a great battle between mounted warriors and what appeared to be a massive grizzly bear. It tells the story of how our people earned the right to call this place home. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Ben began to understand why the Comanche considered this place sacred. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that was both ancient and alive, and the air itself felt different, charged with the accumulated prayers and ceremonies of countless generations. Springs of clear water emerged from the rock walls, creating pools that reflected the sky like mirrors, and the sound of their voices echoed back with an almost musical quality. "There," Tokala said, pointing ahead to where the canyon opened, into a circular amphitheater surrounded by towering stone walls. Winter camp. Safe from soldiers, safe from hunters, safe from all who would harm the people. Ben's breath caught as he saw the encampment spread before them. Perhaps 30 lodges were arranged in a careful pattern around a central fire pit, their buffalo hide coverings painted with designs that spoke of the individual families' histories and achievements. Children played in the snow while women tended fires and prepared food, their voices creating a counterpoint to the deeper tones of the men who sat in council near the largest lodge. But as the war party entered the camp, Ben became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. Conversations stopped, and all eyes turned toward the strange sight of a white man riding among Comanche warriors. Hands moved instinctively toward weapons, and mothers pulled their children closer, uncertain whether this newcomer represented salvation or threat. "Senna," Ben said quietly, suddenly aware of how precarious his position had become. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but Senna was already dismounting, her movements careful and deliberate as she approached the council fire where the tribal elders waited. She began speaking in rapid Comanche, her voice carrying the formal cadences of someone presenting an important case to those in authority. Ben caught only fragments of what she was saying, but he could see the impact of her words in the changing expressions of the listening warriors. An elderly man with silver hair braided with eagle feathers rose from his place by the fire and approached Ben's horse. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence and something that might have been curiosity. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "I am Nadua, keeper of the sacred stories and speaker for the council. The woman Senna tells us you have risked your life to protect her and the child of our fallen brother. She asks that we grant you the protection of our hospitality." Ben dismounted slowly, aware that every warrior in the camp was watching his movements. "I'm honored by her words, but I don't expect anything from your people. I did what any decent man would do." Nadua's eyes narrowed slightly, and Ben realized he had something significant. "You say any decent man would do, but how many? White men have died protecting Comanche women and children. How many have burned their homes and abandoned their lives for people they were taught to see as enemies?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the central fire. Ben understood that this was more than casual conversation. It was a test, a way of determining whether he was worthy of the extraordinary trust the tribe was considering placing In him, I don't know about other men, Ben said finally. I only know that when I looked at Senna and her baby, I saw a mother trying to save her child's life. Everything else was just noise. Nadua studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Slowly, the woman speaks truth about you. You see with eyes that look beyond the surface of things. This is a rare gift among your people. He turned to address the gathered warriors, switching to Comanche for a discussion that became increasingly animated as different voices joined the debate. Ben could not follow the specific words, but the tone was clear enough. Some of the warriors were arguing for his acceptance, while others voiced concerns about the danger of harboring a white man in their most sacred refuge. They debate whether your presence here violates the spiritual protection of the canyon. Senna explained quietly, moving to stand beside Ben. Some fear that white eyes, even friendly ones, bring bad medicine to sacred places. And what do you think? Ben asked. Senna was quiet for a moment, watching the debate unfold around the council fire. I think the spirits brought you to my door in the storm for a reason. Whether that reason is good or bad, only time will tell. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with various warriors stepping forward to voice their opinions. Ben noticed that Takala spoke passionately on his behalf, gesturing toward the canyon walls and the pictographs that recorded the tribe's history. When the blood brother of Senna's husband finally sat down, the council fell silent. Nadua rose again, his expression grave. The council has decided. You will be granted the protection of our hospitality for 7 days, time enough for the immediate danger to pass, and for us to determine whether your presence brings harmony or discord to our sacred place. Ben nodded. Respectfully, I'm grateful for your kindness. I understand the risk you're taking, do you? Nadua's question was sharp. If soldiers discover that we have sheltered a white man, they will use it as justification for destroying this place and scattering our people to the 4 winds. Your presence here could mean the end of everything we have fought to preserve. The weight of responsibility settled on Ben's shoulders like a physical burden. He had been thinking primarily about protecting Senna and her child, but now he understood that his actions had implications far beyond his own conscience. An entire people's survival might depend on decisions made in the next few days. Then I leave, Ben said simply. I won't be the cause of your people's destruction, but Senna stepped forward before Nadua could respond. No, she said firmly. You risked everything to save us. Now we risk everything to save you. This is how family protects family. Her words created a stir among the listening warriors. Ben realized that by calling him family, Senna had made a declaration that changed his status in ways he was only beginning to understand. Among the Comanche, family bonds were sacred, and those who violated them faced consequences that extended far beyond the earthly realm. The woman has spoken. Nadua said solemnly, by the laws of our people, you are now under the protection of her family clan. But this protection comes with obligations as well as privileges. Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. What kind of obligations? If you are to be family, you must prove worthy of that honor. Tomorrow you will be tested in the ways of our people. If you pass, you will be accepted as a brother. If you fail, Nadua's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. As the council dispersed, Ben found himself assigned to a lodge near the center of the camp, its interior warmed by a small fire and furnished with buffalo robes and basic necessities. Senna and her baby were housed in the lodge of her late husband's sister, a stern-faced woman who had accepted the responsibility of caring for the widow and child. What happens tomorrow? Ben asked Senna as she prepared to leave him for the night. You will be tested in the 4 sacred ways, she replied, her voice carrying both encouragement and concern. Courage in battle, wisdom in counsel, skill in the hunt, and strength. In the sacred rituals that bind our people together, Ben absorbed this information with growing unease. And if I fail any of these tests? Then you will be cast out of the canyon to face whatever fate awaits you in the outside world, Senna said simply. But failure is not the worst possibility. What do you mean? If the elders determine that your presence has brought bad medicine to our sacred place, they may decide that your spirit must be released here. In the traditional way, Ben understood her meaning. Death would be preferable to exile if it meant protecting the tribe's spiritual integrity. He had committed himself to a path that might end with his execution, carried out by the very people he had risked everything to help. Why didn't you tell me this before we came here? He asked. Senna met his gaze steadily. Because you would have chosen to face Pike's bounty hunters rather than put my people at risk. And because I believed then, as I believe now, that you have the heart of a true warrior, regardless of the color of your skin. After she left, Ben sat alone in the lodge, staring into the flames and contemplating the series of choices that had brought him to this moment. 12 hours ago, he had been a solitary rancher with no one to worry about but himself. Now he was facing trials that would determine not only his own fate but the future of an entire people. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the camp settling into its evening routine. Children's laughter mixed with the low voices of adults discussing the day's events, while somewhere in the distance, a flute played a haunting melody that seemed to capture all the beauty and sadness of a people fighting to preserve their way of life. Ben thought about the pictographs on the canyon walls, the stories they told of courage and sacrifice, of warriors who had faced impossible odds to protect their families and their sacred places. Tomorrow, he would add his own story to that ancient record, either as a tale of honor earned or as a warning about the dangers of misplaced trust. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of burning houses and mounted warriors, of Senna's dark eyes and the weight of responsibility that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. When he woke before dawn, Ben found offerings left outside his lodge, a war shirt decorated with porcupine quills, a pair of moccasins crafted from the finest deerskin, and a knife whose blade bore etchings that marked it as a weapon of spiritual significance. Nadua appeared as Ben was examining the gifts, his expression grave but not unkind. The testing begins at sunrise, he said simply. Wear these with honor, and may the spirits judge you worthy of the trust you have been given. Ben dressed slowly, feeling the weight of the sacred garments and understanding that they represented more than mere clothing. They were a statement of faith, a declaration that the Comanche people were willing to risk everything on the belief that honor and courage could transcend the boundaries of race and culture. As the first rays of sunlight touched the canyon walls, Ben emerged from his lodge to find the entire camp assembled around the central fire. Men, women, and children stood in silent witness as he approached the place where his fate would be decided. At the center of the circle, Nadua waited with 3 other elders, their faces painted with symbols that spoke of judgment and spiritual authority. Benjamin Steele, Nadua called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. You have claimed the protection of family bonds and asked to be accepted as a brother among our people. Are you prepared to prove yourself worthy of this honor? Ben looked around the circle of faces, seeing curiosity, skepticism, hope, and fear reflected in equal measure. His eyes found Senna, who stood holding her baby near the edge of the crowd, her expression a mixture of encouragement and anxiety. Ben said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that churned in his stomach. Then let the testing begin, Nadua declared, raising his hands toward the lightning sky. May the spirits guide us to wisdom, and may justice be served according to the ancient ways. The first test would be combat, Ben realized, as warriors began forming a fighting circle around him. But as he prepared to face whatever challenge awaited, he understood that the real test would not be of his physical courage, but of his willingness to completely abandon his old life and embrace a new identity among people who had every reason to consider him their enemy. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. and Benjamin Steele prepared to discover whether redemption was possible for a man who had spent too many years running from his own conscience. The first test came without warning, as true combat always did. Ben had barely finished adjusting the sacred war shirt when Tokala stepped into the circle, his face painted with black and red stripes that transformed him from ally to adversary. In his hands he carried a wooden war club carved with symbols that spoke of battles won and enemies defeated. "The test of courage," Nadua announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancient ritual. "You will face Tokala in single combat, using only the weapons of our ancestors. Victory is not required, but cowardice will not be tolerated." Ben was handed a similar war club, its weight unfamiliar in his hands after years of relying on firearms. The weapon was heavier than it appeared, carved from ironwood and balanced for close combat. As he gripped it, he could feel the eyes of the entire tribe upon him, measuring his every movement. Tokala began circling him with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, his movements hypnotic and deadly. Ben had fought hand-to-hand combat before, but never against an opponent trained from childhood in the brutal efficiency of Comanche warfare. The warrior's first strike came like lightning, the war club whistling through the air where Ben's head had been a split second before. Ben stumbled backward, his unfamiliarity with the weapon immediately apparent. Tokala pressed his advantage, raining down a series of blows that forced Ben to retreat around the circle, desperately trying to block attacks that seemed to come from every angle at once. The watching warriors murmured their approval of Tokala's skill, but Ben could hear the disappointment in their voices. "Fight him!" Senna called out from the crowd, her voice cutting through the sound of clashing wood. "Show them the warrior I saw in your eyes when you faced Pike's men." Her words triggered something deep in Ben's memory, a recognition of the man he had been before years of isolation had dulled his fighting instincts. At Adobe Walls, he had been known for his ability to remain calm under fire, to think clearly when other men panicked. That same clarity descended upon him now. Ben stopped retreating and planted his feet, meeting Tokala's next attack with a counterstrike that caught the warrior across the ribs. The blow was solid enough to make Tokala grunt with pain, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in the warrior's eyes. Ben pressed forward, his movements becoming more fluid as muscle memory took over. The fight became a deadly dance. Two skilled warriors testing each other's limits with weapons that could shatter bone with a single well-placed blow. Ben's years of ranch work had given him tremendous upper body strength, while Tokala's lifetime of training made him faster and more technically proficient. Neither man held a decisive advantage. Blood flowed from cuts on both combatants as the battle wore on, but neither showed signs of yielding. Ben's respect for Tokala grew with each exchange, understanding that the warrior was not merely testing his courage, but teaching him, showing him the true nature of Comanche warfare through direct experience. The end came suddenly, as both men struck simultaneously, their war clubs connecting with devastating force. Ben felt the impact travel up his arm like lightning, while Tokala's weapon splintered against his own. Both warriors staggered backward, breathing hard, their weapons destroyed by the violence of their collision. "Enough," Nadua declared, stepping into the circle. "The test of courage is complete. You have shown that you will not yield in the veiled face of death, and you have earned the respect of our finest warrior." Tokala approached Ben, his face splitting into a genuine smile. "You fight like a Comanche," he said, clasping Ben's shoulder. Stubborn and mean, but with honor, Ben wiped blood from a cut above his eye, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. The first test was complete, but 3 more awaited, each designed to probe different aspects of his character and worthiness. The second test began immediately, as the warriors formed a council circle and presented Ben with a complex dispute that required judgment. 2 families had claimed to the same winter hunting ground, each with legitimate arguments based on tribal law and tradition. Nadua explained the situation in detail, then stepped back to allow Ben to render his decision. "This is the test of wisdom," the elder explained. "A true brother must be able to settle disputes fairly, balancing the needs of individuals against the good of the tribe. Your judgment will determine whether these families remain at peace or fall into blood feud." Ben studied the faces of the two family leaders, seeing the genuine concern and frustration in their eyes. This was not a theoretical exercise, but a real dispute that would affect the lives of dozens of people. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but he forced himself to think clearly. "Tell me about the history of this hunting ground," Ben sighed, addressing both families. "Not just recent history, but the old stories, the way your grandfathers and their grandfathers used this land." The request surprised the assembled warriors, but both family leaders began sharing stories that reached back generations. As Ben listened, he began to understand the deeper currents that flowed beneath the surface dispute. This was not really about hunting rights, but about respect and recognition within the tribe. "The land belongs to neither family," Ben said, finally his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "It belongs to the people, as all hunting grounds do. But each family has earned the right to use it through generations of faithful service to the tribe." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I propose that the families hunt together, sharing the work and the rewards equally. Their combined effort will be more successful than either could achieve alone, and their children will grow up as cousins rather than enemies." The silence that followed was deafening. Ben wondered if he had made a terrible mistake imposing white man's logic on a situation that required understanding of Comanche customs he did not possess. Then one of the family leaders stepped forward. "The white man speaks wisdom," he said solemnly. "My grandfather told stories of such partnerships in the old days when our people were few and the buffalo were many. Perhaps it is time to remember those ways." The second family leader nodded his agreement, and the tension that had filled the council circle dissolved into acceptance. Nadua's expression showed approval, but Ben understood that two tests remained. The third test took them out of the canyon entirely, into the vast wilderness where the Comanche had hunted for generations. Ben found himself mounted on a swift pony, armed with a bow and arrows, pursuing a magnificent elk that had been tracked to a meadow several miles from the sacred canyon. "The test of skill," Nadua explained as they rode. "You must bring down the elk with a single arrow, using only the hunting methods of our people. Failure means the tribe goes hungry. Success means you have proven your ability to provide for your family." Ben had used a bow before, but not for years, and never while riding a horse at full gallop. The elk stood at the far end of the meadow, its massive antlers silhouetted against the morning sky. At the first sound of approaching hoofbeats, it would bolt, presenting a target that was both moving and distant. "One shot," Tokala said, riding alongside Ben. "The elk is sacred to our people. To wound it without killing, it would be a great dishonor." Ben nocked an arrow and urged his pony forward, feeling the animal's muscles bunch beneath him as they charged across the frozen ground. The elk's head came up at the sound of their approach, and Ben could see the moment of decision in its dark eyes. The great animal wheeled and began running, its hooves throwing up clouds of snow as it bounded across the meadow with the fluid grace of a creature born to the wilderness. Ben leaned forward in his saddle, becoming one with his mount as they pursued their quarry. The shot had to be perfect, taken at the exact moment when the elk's gait brought it into optimal position. Ben drew the bowstring back to his ear, feeling the smooth wood of the arrow shaft against his cheek. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the spot just behind the elk's front shoulder where the arrow would find its heart. He released the string with a soft twang, and the arrow flew true across the space between hunter and prey. The elk stumbled, ran a few more steps, then collapsed into the snow, its spirit released cleanly and with honor. "Aye!" Tokala shouted, his war cry echoing across the meadow. The white man shoots like his grandfather was Comanche. The successful hunt filled Ben with a primal satisfaction he had not experienced in years. This was not the mechanical work of cattle ranching, but the ancient dance between hunter and prey that had sustained human beings since the dawn of time. But as they approached the fallen elk, Ben felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. The animal had been magnificent in life, and its death, though necessary, represented the end of something beautiful and irreplaceable. He understood now why the Comanche considered such hunts sacred. "You must ask forgiveness," Nadua said, quietly dismounting beside the elk. "The animal has given its life so that we might live. We honor its sacrifice with gratitude and respect." Ben knelt beside the elk and placed his hand on its still warm flank, feeling the connection between predator and prey that linked all living things. The words he spoke were not Comanche, but they came from the same deep well of reverence that had inspired countless generations of hunters. The fourth and final test waited for them back at the canyon, where the entire tribe had gathered for a ceremony that would determine Ben's ultimate fate. The sacred fire had been built higher than usual, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like prayers made manifest. "The test of spirit," Nadua announced, his voice carrying the authority of ages. "You must enter the sacred sweat, lodge and endure the purification ritual that connects our warriors to the spirit world. Only those who can withstand this trial are worthy to be called brother." Ben had heard stories of Comanche purification rituals, vision quests that pushed participants to the edge of death and beyond. He understood that this final test would be the most challenging, requiring not just physical endurance but spiritual strength. The sweat lodge was a dome-shaped structure covered in buffalo hides, its interior heated by stones that had been heated in the sacred fire until they glowed like miniature suns. As Ben entered the lodge, the heat hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. "You must remain until the spirits speak to you," Nadua said, sealing the entrance behind him. "Some men see visions, others hear voices. All who survive are changed by the experience." The heat was unlike anything Ben had ever experienced, a living thing that seemed to press against him from all sides. Sweat poured from his body, and his vision began to blur as dehydration set in. He could hear the voices of the warriors outside, chanting in ancient rhythms that seemed to pulse with the beating of his own heart. Time lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness. Ben felt his consciousness begin to drift, floating free from his physical body like smoke rising from the sacred fire. In this altered state, he began to see images that seemed more real than reality itself. He saw his wife Sarah as she had been in life, her face radiant with the love they had shared. But instead of reproach for his years of isolation, he saw understanding and forgiveness in her eyes. She spoke to him without words, telling him that his time of mourning was over and that he was free to love again. He saw Senna and her baby, but they were not alone. Other figures surrounded them, generations of Comanche ancestors who had suffered and died defending their people. They welcomed him into their circle, not as a white man who had earned their grudging acceptance, but as a true brother who had proven his worth through sacrifice. Finally, he saw himself as he truly was, not the bitter, isolated rancher who had spent 5 years running from his own conscience, but a man capable of love, courage, and redemption. The vision filled him with a profound sense of peace, a recognition that he had finally found his true home. When Ben emerged from the sweat lodge, he was no longer the same man who had entered. The assembled tribe could see the change in his eyes, the spiritual transformation that marked him as one of their own. Nadua approached him with a smile that spoke of deep satisfaction. "You have passed all 4 tests," the elder said formally. "You have shown courage in battle, wisdom in judgment, skill in the hunt, and strength in the spirit world. By the ancient laws of our people, you are now our brother in all things." The celebration that followed lasted until dawn, with drums and dancing that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon. Ben found himself at the center of it all, no longer an outsider looking in, but a full member of the tribe, with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. As the festivities continued around him, Ben sought out Senna, who stood at the edge of the crowd with her baby in her arms. The look in her eyes had changed, he realized, from gratitude to something deeper and more complex. "You have become one of us," she said quietly. "But what does that mean for your future?" "For our future?" Ben looked around the canyon, seeing the place where he had been reborn as a new man. The tests had proven his worthiness to the tribe, but they had also revealed truths about himself that he was only beginning to understand. "I think," he said carefully, "that some questions can only be answered with time." But even as he spoke, Ben knew that his transformation was not complete. The tests had proven his individual worth, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead, proving that a white man and a Comanche woman could build a life together in a world that would see their love as betrayal. The sacred fire burned lower as dawn approached, but its light seemed to illuminate possibilities that had not existed just hours before. Ben had found his place among the Comanche, but now he faced the even greater challenge of finding his place in Senna's heart. 3 weeks had passed since Ben's acceptance into the tribe, and the sacred canyon had begun to feel like the home he had never known he was searching for. The rhythm of Comanche life had become as natural to him as breathing, rising with the sun to tend the horses, joining the hunting parties that brought meat to the camp, participating in the evening councils, where tribal decisions were made with careful deliberation. But it was the quiet moments with Senna that had truly transformed him from a man merely surviving to one actually living. She had begun teaching him the Comanche language in earnest, not just the basic words needed for daily communication, but the subtle poetry of a people who saw the world through entirely different eyes. As they sat beside the central fire in the evenings, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Ben found himself learning not just words, but ways of thinking that challenged everything he thought he knew about life and love. "In our language, there is no word for ownership as your people understand it," Senna explained one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. "We do not own the land or the animals or even each other. We belong to them, and they belong to us. But it is a belonging of relationship, not possession." Ben considered this concept, understanding that it represented a fundamental difference between the world he had known and the one he was learning to inhabit. "What about marriage?" he asked, surprised by his own boldness. "How do your people understand the bond between a man and a woman?" Senna's expression grew thoughtful, her fingers absently stroking her baby's soft hair. "A marriage is a sacred partnership, a joining of spirits that creates something new while honoring what was. When I married my husband, I did not become his property, nor he mine. We became something greater than either of us alone, and when he died?" Ben asked gently. "Part of me died with him," Senna replied simply. "But part of him lives on. In me and in our son and in the love we shared. Death ends the physical bond, but not the spiritual one." Ben felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, understanding that he was competing not just with a memory, but with a love that transcended death itself. How could he hope to win the heart of a woman whose connection to her departed husband remained as strong as ever? "You look troubled," Senna observed, her dark eyes studying his face with the perception that had first drawn him to her. "Have I said something to disturb you?" Ben started to deny it, then stopped himself. In his old life, he had been a master of emotional concealment, hiding his feelings behind walls of silence and distance. But the man he was becoming among the Comanche had no use for such deceptions. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly, the words hanging between them like a challenge. "And I don't know if there's room in your heart for someone new." Senna's intake of breath was audible, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces, while the rest of the camp settled into sleep around them. "Ben," she began, then stopped, as if searching for words that might not exist in any language. "You saved my life and my son's life. You gave up everything you knew to protect us. How could I not have feelings for you?" "But," Ben prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in her voice. "But I am still in mourning," Senna said, her voice thick with emotion. "My husband has been dead for less than 2 months. Among my people, a widow must wait a full year before she can consider taking another husband." Ben felt his heart sink, understanding that he was asking her to violate not just personal grief, but cultural law. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have spoken." "No," Senna interrupted, reaching across the space between them to touch his hand. "You should have spoken. I needed to hear the words, even if I cannot yet act on them. But Ben, you must understand, if we were to be together before the mourning period ends, it would dishonor my husband's memory and bring shame on both our families." Ben nodded, accepting the painful wisdom of her words. But even as he did, he felt a new kind of torment settling into his chest. To be so close to love, to have it acknowledged and returned, yet to be forced to wait, it was a special kind of agony. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls with an urgency that brought warriors to their feet throughout the camp. Ben rose and moved toward the sound, his hand instinctively finding the knife that had become as much a part of him as his own skin. Tokawa appeared at the canyon entrance, his horse lathered with sweat and his face painted with the black stripes that indicated grave news. Behind him rode 2 other warriors, their expressions equally grim. "Soldiers," Tokawa announced without preamble, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent camp. "Many soldiers moving this way from the east. They have Pawnee scouts with them, men who know the old trails." Nedua emerged from his lodge, his weathered face creased with concern. "How many?" he asked. 200, maybe more," Tokawa replied. "They move in columns with supply wagons and artillery. This is not a patrol but a war party." Ben felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. An army of that size could only mean one thing: someone had discovered the location of the sacred canyon and was coming to destroy it. His mind immediately went to Pike and the scalp hunters, understanding that their defeat at his ranch might have led to this larger catastrophe. "They search for the woman and the white man," Tokawa continued, confirming Ben's worst fears. "The Pawnee scouts, they carry wanted posters with drawings of both faces. There is a bounty of $1,000 gold for their capture." The sum was staggering, more money than most men would see in a lifetime. Ben understood now why the army had committed such resources to finding them. Someone with serious political connections wanted Senna and her baby dead, and him along with them. "How long do we have?" Nedua asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 2 days, maybe less if they push hard," Tokawa replied. "The Pawnee know this country well. They will find the canyon entrance." Ben stepped forward, his decision made. "Then I'll leave now," he said firmly. "If they're hunting me, I'll lead them away from here." "No," Senna said immediately, moving to stand beside him. "If you leave alone, they will capture you and torture you until you reveal the location of our people. We go together, or we stay together. You cannot leave," Nedua said with finality. "The tests you passed, the vows you made, they bind you to this tribe as surely as blood bonds. You are no longer a white man who can simply walk away from our problems." Ben felt the weight of his transformation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. By accepting the tribe's brotherhood, he had also accepted responsibility for their welfare. There could be no half measures, no convenient escape from the consequences of his choices. "Then we fight," he said simply. 200 soldiers against 30 warriors, we faced worse odds. But even as he spoke, Ben knew the mathematics of the situation were hopeless. The Comanche were skilled fighters, but they were outnumbered nearly 7-1 by professional soldiers with modern weapons and artillery support. This would not be a battle but a massacre. "There is another way," Nadua said slowly, his eyes taking on the distant look of a man contemplating desperate measures. "The old stories speak of a sacred ritual, a way to call upon the spirits of our ancestors to protect the tribe in times of great danger." Tokala shook his head violently. "That ritual has not been performed in 50 years. The last time it was attempted, the medicine man who led it died, and the spirits demanded a terrible price." "What kind of price?" Ben asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The life of the one who calls upon them," Nadua replied solemnly. "The spirits of the dead do not give their aid freely. They require a living spirit to join them in exchange for their protection." Ben felt Senna's hand grip his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with desperate strength. "No," she whispered. "There must be another way." But even as she spoke, Ben understood that the choice had already been made. The moment he had opened his door to a desperate woman and her dying child, he had set in motion events that would lead inevitably to this moment. Some debts, he realized, could only be paid with everything a man had to give. "How does the ritual work?" he asked, ignoring Senna's protest. Nadua studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his worthiness for such knowledge. "The chosen. One must enter the deepest part of the canyon, where the spirits of our ancestors are strongest. There, he must offer his life freely, without reservation or regret. If his sacrifice is judged worthy, the spirits will rise to defend the tribe. And if it's not?" Ben asked. "Then he dies for nothing, and the tribe perishes anyway," Nadua replied with brutal honesty. Ben looked around the camp, seeing the faces of people who had become his family, understanding that their lives now hung in the balance of his decision. Children played in the firelight, unaware that their world was about to be shattered by the approach of an army that saw them as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be protected. "I'll do it," he said simply. "Ben, no." Senna's voice cracked with emotion. "You cannot ask me to lose another husband to war." Her words stopped him cold, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. "Husband?" he asked quietly. Senna's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "In my heart, you already are. The mourning period, the tribal laws, they are just words. My spirit recognized yours the moment you opened your door to us." Ben felt his resolve wavering for the first time, understanding that he was not just sacrificing his own life, but destroying the future they might have built together. "Then maybe there's something worth living for after all," he said, reaching out to touch her face. But before he could speak further, war cries echoed from the canyon entrance. The Pawnee scouts had found them, and the battle was beginning. Whether they were ready or not, "Too late," Tokala shouted, already running toward his horse. "They have found us." The next few minutes were chaos as the camp erupted into frantic activity. Warriors grabbed their weapons while women and children fled toward the deepest recesses of the canyon. Ben found himself separated from Senna in the confusion, their last conversation hanging unfinished between them. "The ritual," Nadua shouted over the sound of approaching gunfire. "If you're going to do it, it must be now." Ben looked toward the canyon entrance, where muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly stars. The Pawnee scouts were already inside, and the main force of soldiers would not be far behind. In minutes, the sacred canyon would become a killing ground. "Where?" Ben asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The sacred pool," Nadua replied, pointing toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon. "Follow the path until you reach the water that never freezes. There, the spirits wait." Ben started toward the passage, then stopped and turned back. "If I don't survive this, tell Senna that she was right. Some things are worth dying for." "Tell her yourself," Nadua replied grimly. "The spirits may yet find a way to preserve what you have built together." Ben ran toward the sacred pool, leaving behind the battle that would determine the fate of everyone he had learned to love. Behind him, the canyon echoed with gunfire and war cries, as two civilizations clashed in a conflict that would leave no one unchanged. The path to the sacred pool was treacherous, winding through narrow passages and over loose rock that threatened to send him tumbling into the darkness below. But Ben pressed forward, driven by the understanding that he was racing not just against time but against fate itself. As he reached the pool, he could see why the Comanche considered it sacred. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the stars above like a mirror to the spirit world. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, telling stories of sacrifice and redemption that stretched back to the beginning of time. Ben knelt beside the pool and spoke the words Nadua had taught him, calling upon the spirits of the ancestors to rise in defense of their people. The water began to glow with an inner light, and he felt a presence that was both ancient and immediate. "I offer my life freely," Ben said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Take it, and let my people live," the spirits answered, and Benjamin Steele prepared to discover whether love could truly conquer death itself. The sacred pool erupted in light as ancient spirits answered Ben's call, their ethereal forms rising from the water like memories given substance. These were the ghosts of Comanche warriors who had died defending their people across countless generations, their translucent faces bearing the marks of battles fought and won in times when the world was younger and the sacred places still held absolute power. "You offer your life for people not born to your blood," spoke the spirit of a great war chief, his voice echoing from beyond the veil of death. "Why should we accept such a sacrifice from one who was our enemy?" Ben felt the weight of judgment pressing down upon him, understanding that his worthiness would be measured not by his recent actions, but by the deeper truths of his character. "Because they are my people now," he replied, his voice steady despite the supernatural terror that surrounded him. "One chose them, and they chose me. Blood is not the only bond that makes a family." The spirits began to circle him, their forms flickering like flames in an otherworldly wind. Ben could feel their ancient power pressing against his consciousness, probing his memories and motivations with an intensity that left him emotionally naked. "We see your past," another spirit intoned, its voice carrying the weight of absolute knowledge. "The battle at Adobe Walls where you killed 12 of our warriors. The years of hatred you carried in your heart. The wife whose death turned you against all human connection." Ben flinched as the spirits laid bare his darkest moments, the actions and attitudes that had defined him before Senna's arrival changed. "Everything. I was a different man then," he said. "I let grief and anger make me into something I never should have been. And what has changed you?" The first spirit asked, its form becoming more solid as it approached. "What power could transform a killer of our people into one willing to die for them?" The answer came to Ben with perfect clarity, a truth so simple and profound that it cut through all the complexity of his transformation. "Love," he said simply. "Love changed me. Love for a woman who showed me that courage comes from protecting others, not destroying them. Love for a child who needed a father more than I needed my hatred. Love for a people who taught me that family is what you choose, not what you're born with." The spirits fell silent, their forms shimmering as they communed with powers beyond mortal understanding. Ben could hear the distant sound of battle echoing through the canyon, the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded men mixing with the supernatural energies that surrounded him. "Your love is true," the war chief spirit finally pronounced. "But the price of our intervention remains the same. One life must be given freely to purchase the protection of many. Are you prepared to pay that price?" Ben thought of Senna, of the love they had finally acknowledged but might never have the chance to fully explore. He thought of little Iacos, who deserved to grow up in a world where his mixed heritage was a source of strength rather than shame. He thought of the Comanche warriors who had accepted him as a brother, and the women and children who had welcomed him into their lives. "I am," he said, and meant it completely. But before the spirits could claim his life, another voice cut through the supernatural atmosphere of the sacred pool. "Wait!" Senna called out, her footsteps echoing off the canyon walls as she ran toward them. "There is another way." The spirits turned their attention to her, their forms becoming more agitated as she approached. "The woman should not be here," the war chief spirit said sternly. "This is a place for the dead and those who would join them. I am the widow of your grandson," Senna replied with dignity that transcended fear. "I have the right to speak in this sacred place." Ben stared at her in amazement, understanding that she had left the battle to follow him into what might be certain death. "Senna, you can't be here. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than losing the man I love to a sacrifice that may not even work," she replied, her eyes blazing with determination. "The old stories speak of another way, a ritual that requires not death but transformation." The spirits grew more agitated, their forms flickering between solid and ethereal. "The ritual of binding," the war chief spirit said slowly. "It has not been attempted in over a century. The risks are too great." "What risks?" Ben asked, though he suspected he might not want to know the answer. "The ritual would bind your spirit permanently to our people," Senna explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "You would become not just a brother by adoption, but a true member of the tribe in ways that transcend death itself. But if it fails, you would be trapped forever between the world of the living and the world of the dead." Ben absorbed this information, understanding that she was offering him a chance at life, but at a cost that might be worse than death. And if it succeeds, then the spirits would have a living warrior to channel their power through, the war chief spirit replied. "Your body would become a vessel for their ancient strength, allowing them to fight alongside the tribe without claiming your life." The sound of battle grew closer, and Ben could hear Tokala's voice shouting orders as the Comanche warriors fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Time was running out, and he had to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everyone he had learned to love. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "Whatever the cost, I'll pay it." Senna moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his as the spirits began to form a circle around them. "Not alone," she said firmly. "The ritual requires a spiritual anchor. Someone whose love for the warrior is strong enough to guide him back from the edge of death." "The woman speaks truth," the war chief spirit acknowledged. "But if she fails to maintain the connection, both of you will be lost forever." Ben looked into Senna's eyes, seeing in them the same absolute determination that had carried her through the storm to his door. "Are you sure about this?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I lost one husband to war. I will not lose another to unnecessary sacrifice." The spirits began to chant in a language older than memory, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the earth. Ben felt power flowing through him, ancient and terrible and beautiful. As the ghostly warriors began to merge their essence with his living flesh, the transformation was agony beyond description, as if every cell in his body was being rewritten by forces that existed beyond the normal laws of nature. Ben felt his consciousness expanding, becoming something larger and more complex than his individual self, while Senna's love served as the anchor that kept him tethered to his humanity. "I can feel them," he gasped, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been there before. "All of them. Hundreds of warriors, all wanting to protect their people." "Let them," Senna said, her grip on his hand tightening. "But remember who you are. Remember what you're fighting for." The ritual reached its climax as the spirits completed their merger with Ben's living form. He could feel their memories, their skills, their absolute dedication to protecting the tribe flowing through him like molten metal through his veins. But through it all, Senna's love remained constant, a lifeline that connected him to the world. Of the living, it is done, the war chief spirit announced, its form beginning to fade as its essence became part of Ben's enhanced being. Go now, and defend your people with the strength of the ancestors. Ben rose from beside the sacred pool, feeling power coursing through him that was both alien and familiar. He was still himself, but he was also something more, a living bridge. Between the world of the dead and the world of the living, a warrior enhanced by the accumulated skill and courage of generations. Can you feel them? Senna asked, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at him. Every one of them, Ben replied, his voice carrying the authority of ages. They're ready to fight. They ran together toward the sound of battle. Ben moving with a speed and grace that defied his human limitations. As they reached the main canyon, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The army had broken through the narrow entrance and was systematically destroying everything in its path, Tokala and his. Warriors had taken defensive positions among the rocks, but they were being pushed back by superior numbers and firepower. Ben could see Pawnee scouts moving through the shadows, their intimate knowledge of Comanche tactics making them deadly opponents for the defenders. There, Senna pointed toward a group of soldiers who had cornered a family of non-combatants. Near the central fire, the children, Ben moved without conscious thought, the spirits within him guiding his actions with supernatural precision. He appeared among the soldiers like a force of nature, his movements too fast for human eyes to follow. The enhanced strength flowing through him made their weapons useless, and within seconds, the family was free. But even as he fought, Ben could feel the terrible cost of the ritual. Each use of the spirit's power burned through his life force. Like fire through dry wood. He was becoming something magnificent and terrible, but he was also consuming himself in the process. Ben! Senna's voice cut through the chaos as she pointed toward the canyon entrance. More soldiers coming. He could see them now. A seemingly endless stream of blue uniforms pouring through the narrow passage. The main force had arrived, and with them came the artillery that would reduce the sacred canyon to rubble. Ben made a decision that would have been impossible for his merely human self. Drawing on the full power of the ancestral spirits, he began to run toward the canyon entrance, moving with a speed that left afterimages in the air behind him. The soldiers at the entrance opened fire, but their bullets passed through him. As if he were made of smoke and shadow. Ben reached the narrowest part of the passage and placed his hands against the rock walls, feeling the ancient power flowing through him into the stone itself. What are you doing? Senna called out, having followed him despite the danger. Closing the door, Ben replied, his voice echoing with the power of the spirits. Permanently, the canyon walls began to tremble as Ben channeled the full force of the ancestral spirits into the rock. Cracks appeared in the stone, spreading like spider webs as the ancient power worked to seal the entrance forever. The soldiers outside, Senna said urgently. They'll be trapped. No, Ben said, his enhanced senses allowing him to perceive things beyond normal human understanding. They're pulling back. They know what's happening. The canyon entrance collapsed with a roar that shook the earth, sealing the sacred place away from the outside world forever. The soldiers who had already entered were trapped, but Ben could feel their panic and desperation, even as the spirits began to fade from his consciousness. It's done, he said, his voice returning to normal human tones as the supernatural power began to ebb. The canyon is protected, but even as he spoke, Ben felt the terrible cost of what he had accomplished. The ritual had worked, but using so much power so quickly had burned through his life force at an unsustainable rate. He was dying, consumed by the very spirits that had saved his people. Ben, Senna said, catching him as he collapsed. Stay. With me. He looked up into her face, seeing tears streaming down her cheeks. The mourning period, he said weakly. You don't have to wait anymore. What do you mean? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. My death completes the ritual. Ben explained, his voice growing fainter. The spirits are satisfied. They'll protect the canyon forever now. No, Senna said fiercely. You're not dying. We're going to build a life together, remember? We're going to watch Ayakos grow up and teach him to be proud of both sides of his heritage. Ben tried to respond, but he could feel his consciousness slipping away. The spirits had taken what they needed, and now they were releasing him to whatever fate awaited beyond the veil of death. But as darkness began to close around him, Ben felt something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the spirits or their ancient power. It was Senna's love, pure and strong and absolutely unbreakable, calling him back from the edge of oblivion. Come back to me, she whispered, her lips against his ear. I need you. Ayakos needs you. Your people need you. The warmth grew stronger, and Ben realized that the ritual had created more than just a weapon against the tribe's enemies. It had forged a bond between him and Senna that transcended death itself, a connection that would allow him to choose life over the spirit world's call. He opened his eyes to find himself lying in Senna's arms, weak but alive. Around them, the canyon was quiet except for the sounds of the tribe tending to their wounded and celebrating their miraculous survival. How? He asked weakly. Love, Senna replied simply. The same power that changed you from an enemy into a brother. The same power that will bind us together for the rest of our lives. Ben struggled to sit up, feeling human again, but somehow more than he had been before. The spirits were gone, but they had left something behind, a deep understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. Marry me, he said suddenly, the words coming from a place deeper than thought. Not because of tribal law or mourning periods, but because I love you more than life itself. Senna's smile was radiant as she leaned down to kiss him. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it, as the sun rose over the sealed canyon, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and crimson. Ben understood that he had found something more precious than all the gold in the world. He had found a family, a purpose, and a love that would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The lonely rancher who had once lived in bitter isolation was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood that the greatest treasures in life were the ones you shared with others. Ben Steele had opened his door to strangers one snowy night, and in doing so, had discovered that love truly was the most powerful force in the universe. In the distance, little Ayakos began to cry, and Ben rose to comfort the child who would grow up calling him father. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, and Ben knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Because sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the simple act of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and family over everything else the world might offer in return.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.